Today's book is The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis, and what a problem it is. I'll briefly talk through the structure of Lewis's arguments, what I liked, what I didn't like, but I really want to focus on three big ideas that I took away from reading this book. And then I want to zoom out and see the bigger picture of why a discussion about pain matters today, especially when you compare Lewis's account to other philosophies of human experience and suffering that are gaining traction today in the popular discourse. So first, let's set the table and get some context. Clive Staples Lewis published this book in 1940. He was a fellow at Oxford at the time. Later in his life, he was appointed chair at Cambridge. But the thing to keep in mind with Lewis is he was an atheist for much of his early life, up until he started immersing himself more in literature through his academic work. And it was this that led to his conversion to Christianity, and then subsequently taking up the work of apologetics that would comprise most of his writing. But it wasn't very long after his newfound faith that he stumbled upon a difficult problem. You may have asked yourself the question before, why do bad things happen to good people? Why would God allow suffering to exist? And this is the question that Lewis set out to address in Problem of Pain. In his methodology, he sums up the argument very nicely, saying, if God were good, then he would be able to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures aren't happy. Therefore, God lacks either goodness or power, or both. This is the problem of pain in its simplest form. And I think every single one of us, religious or not, can agree with that basic idea. But to understand Lewis's answer to that question, first we need to ask ourselves, what do we mean exactly by God's goodness? This was the first big takeaway for me from reading the book. It's what Lewis calls God's intolerable complement. And what he's getting at is the idea of God's goodness or God's love has been diluted and stripped down from its original meaning to what we now think of as something more akin to kindness. In the book, Lewis points this out, saying, we want not so much a father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven, some senile, benevolent figure who likes to simply see young people enjoying themselves. He also says, kindness cares not whether its object becomes good or bad, provided simply that it escapes suffering. And this distortion of goodness is clearly what drives how adamant our culture is about blaming issues of social justice on oppression solely, and refusing to inspect the role of individual behavior and morality. The theme is something like Solomon's eat, drink, and be merry. And it's that ambivalence to the role of judgment that Lewis is rejecting here. And it's not some sort of vindictive motive to see people getting their just desserts. Suffering is clearly not reserved only for people that deserve it. And we'll directly address that issue later in this video. But what Lewis is getting at here is the intolerable complement of God's love and all that comes along with it. And it's intolerable precisely because of how far removed we are from the ideal of God's love and the pain that results from having to burn and strip away all of the shortcomings of our soul. A quote that really resonates here, Lewis says, the doors of hell are often locked on the inside. And we know that's the case, don't we? I mean, a lot of ways, human pain and suffering is self-imposed. And it's important to point that out because the people who argue that pain is proof that God doesn't exist, they have a tendency to kind of gloss over like 80% of suffering. I'm pulling that number out of nowhere, but my point is the vast majority of what people suffer from is self-imposed. Heart disease, cancers, diabetes. Of the top 10 leading causes of death, at least 7 of them have a 50% incidence rate from lifestyle choices. What that means is literally half of what kills people is a result of self-imposed suffering. And that should not be a footnote in this discussion, regardless of your metaphysics or your ideology. Lewis says pain plants the flag of truth within a rebel fortress, and clearly there's a truth behind the vast majority of this self-imposed pain that the world experiences. And that pain is pointing to the reality of the necessity to acknowledge free will, to acknowledge moral truth, to practice self-control, to reduce the suffering that advocates of social justice claim they so strongly are against. To neglect that truth is to amplify the suffering. And I can't see a flaw in that part of Lewis's argument. And this is a good place to come at an oblique angle to inspect this problem of pain and talk about what pain means in a world without purpose. Throughout the book, Lewis is developing this sketch of pain as an intersection where religious narrative meets the material world. And here's what I mean by that. Science has given us this great ability to understand the biological process of pain, but we're still clueless when it comes to measuring pain itself. In science, if it can't be measured or quantified, then it's not real. But I would claim that it's actually more real than any scientific fact. And the reason I say that is because pain is what drives the scientific enterprise itself. Science, from physics and chemistry to biology and medicine, all of it is an attempt to understand the world in an effort to take knowledge and apply it for the purpose of reducing human suffering. The end result of any scientific discovery is for that information to be put to use for the sake of improving the quality of life of people and removing uncertainty and suffering and pain. And that's really interesting because what that means is that even the most grounded and the most fundamental science is rooted in a narrative of human beings trying to escape pain. The only method that we have for measuring pain so far is the self-report 1 to 10 scale of pain, where 1 is happy and 10 is like when you're on fire or something. Completely subjective and also completely narrative driven. It's driven by the internal narrative that a person tells themselves about the nature of reality. The pain that we experience is inevitably tied to the purpose that we assign to that pain. And we know this because there are college students rolling around on the floor of their university classrooms crying about microaggressions. And at the same time, there's children in other parts of the world that don't have enough food to eat, but they still laugh, play, and they bear that suffering with grace. For Lewis, pain is a consequence of the fall. And God's love seeks to draw us closer to him and away from that pain. Now, on the other hand, taking the view of determinism and atheism, there is no purpose to pain. Pain is a transient, subjective, simply a fact of the physical universe, and it's not linked to any religious or ethical framework. And I think that philosophy cripples your ability to address the majority of pain and suffering, which is self-imposed. But here we've come to the elephant in the room, and here it is. Not all suffering and pain is self-imposed. In fact, the reality is sometimes bad things happen to good people. And as human beings, we want answers, and none of us are satisfied, myself included, with a simplistic idea that suffering can always just be traced back to some sin. That's just not going to cut it here. And sometimes it's the least deserving, the most innocent, and the best of humanity that suffers the most. And Lewis points this out. He's just as conflicted about pain as anyone else, especially this type of pain. He's writing this book to try to understand, but at the same time, he also acknowledges the answers that he might find won't absolve him from this problem of pain. And this was the third thing that I took away from reading the book, probably the hardest concept to come to terms with. Lewis cites this metaphor from St. Augustine. He says, God wants to give us something, but he can't because our hands are full. There's nowhere for him to put it. What then can God do in our interest but make our own life less agreeable and take away the plausible source of false happiness? And to make matters even more complicated, the people he's referring to are people with whom all is well in a worldly sense. They have fulfilling jobs, loving families. Their time and their attention is occupied with worthy goals and admirable causes. Their lives are full. But in that fullness, there's no room for God or for the lessons that God needs to teach them. I don't know how to handle that if it's true. I don't know if God actively works to make life less agreeable. There's nothing in the Bible to support that idea. But it may be the case that success and happiness and innocence or virtue, these things might possibly lead us to an illusion of self-sufficiency, that we are complete in and of ourselves. And pain may be this law that's instilled in the universe to remind us that this is not the case. Now, before we get into the big picture takeaway, I have this test that I do when I read a book, and I call it the SOB test. SOB in this context stands for some other book. And the idea is simple. Was this book honestly interesting enough to keep my attention? Did I catch myself drifting off at any point? If it passes the test, then I was engaged the entire time. But if it fails, that means pretty much all I could think about was some other book that I could have been reading, and I'll probably never read it again. Now, this was the first book of C.S. Lewis's that I've read, and it's a really heavy topic, and honestly, I wish Lewis had spent more time elaborating on this, because I think it's a topic worth digging into a little bit more deeply. But I'm happy to say that it passed the SOB test. I found his writing interesting and easy to read. Sometimes he does write in these really long sentences, and you almost have to keep track of the breadcrumbs to follow through with his line of thought. But I didn't experience any reader's regret, and I plan on reading it again in the future. Finally, before I finish a book and I put it back on the shelf, I take a second and step back and try to look at the big picture, the view from 10,000 feet. And I ask myself, okay, Alex, you've read the book. Now, how's it going to change your life? And for me, to see the big picture in this book, I had to return to that original question that we asked at the beginning, which was, why would God allow suffering to exist? Now, I don't know what to make of this answer, but if I can get to the core of what I think Lewis is saying, it's this. Pain is the result of the fall. We send ourselves into existence, and because of that, we have to live out the consequences. Now, success, goodness, these are both necessary aspects of our time on earth, and we should be striving for these things actively. But even so, they're not sufficient. And the reason is that we have a distance, a gap between ourselves and God by default as a result of our humanity. Even the best of us and the least deserving have this gap. And pain is a reminder of the reality that we inhabit that gap in our time here on earth, in a world that's broken because it's separated from God. And the purpose of pain, as intolerable as it is to break that illusion of self-sufficiency and self-determination to make room for us to receive what God needs to give us. Now, you may still be wondering, okay, but still, how do we deal with pain? And for that, you might want to check out this review I did exploring Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. As always, thank you for watching, and be light, everybody.